Hello, everybody. This is Renault, and today I came across this story from Bleeding Cool, and I had to make a video about it. Now, it's been a while since I've made a video, but this really caught my eye, and so I was like, you know what? I want to talk about this. And so, this story from Bleeding Cool by Rich Johnston talks about a scoop. DC Comics buyout in the works from fans with lots of money. So, let's get right into it. DC Comics has had one hell of a rough year. They fired their publisher, Dan Didio, 2 editors-in-chief, whose name I forget but are in the links, and many staffers who have been at the company for decades, with more expected. And that, I don't know the full names of everybody involved. What matters is that that also included that piece of shit Andy Corey. Now, going back to the article, all as a result of the AT&T buyout from Warner's, the pandemic, and cuts across the board, needed Oxford comma here. But Bleeding Cool understands that it was former DC president Diane Nelson's decision to move DC Comics from the relatively expensive offices in Manhattan to insanely expensive offices in Burbank that was the biggest factor in the decision. The move from coast to coast succeeded in making DC work better as part of Warner as a whole, with many projects spinning out of that increased proximity. But it also brought greater financial pressure on every project, including the publication of comic books. And that proximity was entirely absent this year, with Warner's continuing to work remotely. But that work still has to justify the cost of that empty building. So in case of those of you who didn't know, DC Comics used to be located in New York, and around 2015 or so, DC moved, and so some people had to be let go, but then some people got brought in, including that piece of shit Andy Corey, because, you know, not everybody was willing to move from New York to the LA suburbs. Now, what I didn't know was that it was Diane Nelson's decision that did that, and it was a silly decision because people could have always been doing these jobs remotely. You don't need an editor in person to edit comics. You don't need anybody in comics to be in person, except maybe shipping and receiving. And I don't know how big their shipping and receiving is, but it couldn't be that many. So basically, about 90% of the work being done at DC could have been done remotely from the get-go, but oh, womp womp. A lot of people got fired because of Diane Nelson. Diane Nelson made a lot of stupid mistakes, but you can rely on Ethan Van Sciver to go into that in more detail. Let's continue on with the article. Bleeding Cool has heard repeated reports that DC Comics is planning to reduce serialized print publication, increase digital publication, and license comic book publications to other publishers. We have heard that Marvel, IDW, and Dynamite have all approached DC, but the prices cited were too high. But that it was a price that Penguin Random House was willing to pay. Now, for those of you who don't know Penguin Random House, they're pretty much the one of the biggest names in the market when it comes to reaching out to children and kids. They do like book fairs, bookmobiles, and that sort of thing inside of the schools. So this could actually be very lucrative when you get access to millions of children, but that was before the COOF. The Chinese Wuhan COOF virus shut down the American economy. Anyway, going back, but this is all a rumor and hearsay. From prominent people, sure, but still. Because I have also heard that it is guns blazing at DC Comics right now. From Future State to Infinite Frontier, sales per title are up. Way up. The line is smaller with fewer editorial staff. It has to be. But per title, per allocated desk space in that empty Burbank building, profitability is up. It also helps that some other rather pricey exclusive Raider deals are also a thing of the past. So what this is referring to is Brian Michael Bendis finally being kicked out of DC Comics, and some of his hotel writers are gone as well. And now, rumor has it that Brian Michael Bendis was making $1,000 per page as a writer. Now, the thing is, Brian Michael Bendis, from what I saw, was never a great writer. Well, okay, he was. He brought in the Whedon-esque speak into the comic book universe, but they could have also had that if they had just brought on Josh Whedon. The point is, he was making $1,000 per page. He seemed to have like a control of like a quarter of all the books coming out of DC. I don't know whether he was writing them directly, but he was certainly in control. And on top of that, Brian Michael Bendis was also part of the DC Storybook Group, or something similar to that, where they were trying to link up the books with the movies. And there was never a reason to do that because, one, books and movies are completely separate, and two, it was just holding up the production. And just like how Marvel gave their storybook group the boot when it comes to their comic book movie division, DC Comics ultimately gave Brian Michael Bendis and his slate of cronies the boot anyway, because they don't add anything of value. And you can kind of see that with the Star Wars storybook group, who are still hanging on, but they're adding nothing to Star Wars anyway. So that's a bit of a tangent. The point is, Brian Michael Bendis was very expensive. He brought in a bunch of cronies to work with him, like Matt Fraction and the infamously terrible Kelly Sue DeConnick. And they were also, well, I can't speak for Matt Fraction, but Kelly, everything she touched turned to garbage. So she was part of Brian Michael Bendis' crew. So they're gone. And that's a great thing, because none of them were, regardless of how good Brian Michael Bendis was in the past, none of his hangers-on were any good, and they were just sucking up time and attention like a vacuum. Going back to the article, there is some suspicion that everything is resting on the Infinite Frontier performance as to whether or not DC Comics continues to have serialized print comic publishing line, but as it stands, things are very good. Better they have been at DC for some time. With their new diversity pushes, they have also seen positive mainstream press they have sought for years as well. That's this is pretty much not true with the whole diversity pushes. Every time DC brings out a new character, it's always overhyped, no matter what. So the whole diversity push doesn't mean anything. And you'll also notice that he's praising the attention, but not the sales. I'm going to read this again. With the new diversity pushes, they have also seen positive mainstream press they have sought for years as well. Again, the diversity pushes is bringing in more money, but it's bringing in more press. But they've always had a free press anyway, so they might as well have not brought anything at all. Going back to the article, however, very good comics may not be very good for Warners, who have to put the space and expenses allocated to comic books against that allocated for TV, games, movies, and more in terms of profitability. The comics are making money, but are they making enough money to justify the space and resources allocated to them, even if they are not using them? Again, this is Rich Johnston really hammering home the point that there's this gigantic, expensive building in Burbank that they're not even using. Which, again, no real sympathy, since, like I mentioned, 90% of the jobs at DC could have been done from telecommuting anyway. If they really needed a new building, they didn't have to get a gigantic one. So going back to the article, we'll see. Infinite Frontier Zero is out in March, with Infinite Tier number 1 to follow in July. By then, we should get a better look at the lay of the land. But there are other plans as well. And finally, I get to what on earth I was talking about in the headline. You've been patient enough. Last year, a number of high-rolling individuals were given tours of DC Comics Burbank with AT&T Warner's officials. And as a result, there may be some new options, because Bleeding Cool has been made aware of plans by big-time DC comic fans with access to a lot of money. Many millions from across many businesses. A collaboration of some of the biggest cheeses who, with a combination of personal wealth and raised capital, are making an approach to AT&T, and not to buy DC Comics outright from AT&T Warners, not to touch the movies, the TV, the games, or the merchandise, but solely the rights and ownership of the comic book side of the publisher, to be able to create and publish DC Comics line as they would like. Let Warner do the movies and TV shows, but take all the cumbersome work of actually publishing comic books off their hands, while Warners are free to adapt as they wish. If you could be a member of this group, you have probably already been approached. People who can bring or can raise a minimum of 8 figures apiece, who have both an Action Comics #1 and a Detective Comics #27 to spare, and who really, really like DC Comics. The fans are taking over the Arkham Asylum. So what say you? Would you welcome such a move? And what do you think of Warner's response would be? So to touch on this that Rich Johnson is talking about, Ethan Van Sciver actually leaked it like almost 6 months ago, that there was grumblings inside of DC, and that DC was very likely to stop publishing comics altogether by June or July or such. And if it's coming from some people inside, then fine. And you can tell that there might have been some very that might have been credible, because you can see from the tenor of this article, DC is looking to get out of publishing. That's what Ethan Van Sciver said 6 months ago. And now all of a sudden you see them talking about selling off their IP to people to license out. That's exactly what Ethan Van Sciver said. So a lot of people were like, boo-hoo, that would never happen. Well, you're kind of sort of seeing it. Now, personally, if DC is looking to sell off the rights and ownership to people for 8 figures, then DC doesn't have anything that's worth 8 figures to license out. Because you think about, you have to pay all that 8 figures worth and then cross your fingers and hope to make it back. I mean, unless you're thinking about what Paramount did with maybe Star Trek or something, and Kurtzman's Trek is terrible. So maybe that's the kind of deal they're referring to, but that's never going to happen. Licensing, in many ways, just doesn't pay for itself. It's not worth it. Look at IDW. They license almost every single one of their comics, and they're practically bankrupt. So anyway, I just really had to go over this, mostly because it kind of vindicates a lot of what Ethan Van Sciver's been saying, because he has his share of insiders as well. And this is something Ethan Van Sciver talked about 6 months ago. As for licensing, if it's cheap, let me correct that. Let me rephrase that. If the licensing price is like based on a percentage sales, then maybe you buy the license and outright, and then you don't have to split any other profits. But yeah, it just has to be done right. And I don't know. I don't trust DC, because Warner Brothers is the most, and AT&T are the most incompetent entertainment company on earth. Anyway, what do you think about this story from Bleeding Cool? Go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.